fake world of William Shakespeare.
Okay, this is part 10, basis 137 with Bob Osborne, talking about, in detail, Francis Bacon. So take it away, Bob.
Okay, well, hello, Miles, again. Once more into the breach, to quote the great bard, William Shakespeare, aka Francis Bacon. So, I think we did episode 9 where we chatted briefly about the whole Shakespeare hoax, which as far as I'm concerned is the biggest con perpetrated on the British public for 400 years.
Apart from all the other biggest cons.
Yeah, I know, it's a toss-up, isn't it? Probably in the top 10 anyway, let's put it that way. So, as I said, I was going to go into more detail about that because we only did about a quick chat, and it's a very complicated story, probably more complicated than most of Shakespeare's plays. So I'm going to chat about what I've discovered researching this particular rabbit hole. Also, I like to introduce things that are of interest to me, in the sense that a lot of my, I won't call it channeling, but a lot of my guesswork or research tends to come through my DNA. So if I can actually physically be in the place, for example, when I was writing my Zena book, I was living on the farm where D.H. Lawrence had lived 100 years before, swimming in the same pool, tending the same vegetable patch. So I always like to get myself to know a lot of people, even if it's the descendants or friends of friends, 1 or 2 degrees of separation. If I'm researching someone, I find that helps. So certainly when I was looking at Shakespeare and Francis Bacon, I found a lot of synchronicity in my own relationships and work as an artist, and generally what I think about and how it's affected me over the last 400 years. My family having a kind of a bit of an outlaw place in British history, certainly at this time as well. So I'm going to go along and just chat about what's happened to me over the last few years and how it connects to the Shakespeare and the Francis Bacon project. So on this screen here, this is a photograph of me, believe it or not, dressed as William Shakespeare, and my then girlfriend Carrie Reichardt is dressed as Anne Hathaway. So the whole concept of the mask is very relevant because, as people probably know, throughout the Shakespeare plays, the mask was used a lot. And the tradition of the mask came from Venice, with the masked balls, the masquerades, and it's to do with deception and also with ritual. So Francis Bacon was also one of the many amazing things he did, was to introduce the mask into the theatre at that time. So in this photograph, my girlfriend at that time is a very brilliant artist and a ceramicist, and also very eccentric. That's Carrie wearing the Anne Hathaway mask, and in 2018 she was given a gig as the artist in residence at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. So anything that says trust in, immediately it's a bit of a red light for me, because especially connected to Shakespeare and trust the science and things like that. So that will become apparent as we talk about Bacon. So in this gig, which I participated in because we were working together as artists, her brand was Made in England and my brand was Rebel Not Taken. So we'd previously combined our brands and had them tattooed on our shoulders, and of course my Rebel Not Taken brand, which I've spoken about before, is to do with my ancestor who got hunted down for trying to overthrow the monarchy of James II. And the Mad of England brand is, fits nicely because it's to do with just the whole eccentric place that England is. So Carrie had a very interesting background. She was actually a baroness, and her grandfather was made a baron by the Tsar of Russia in the First World War. So she also did performance art, and one of the best things that I enjoyed most was she had a bra made of 2 pigs' heads, dried pigs' heads, which she used to wear on stage. Other interesting things that link into Bacon. I mean, we spent 6 months in Stratford-on-Avon. She was provided with a flat, and we had access to the wardrobe. The wardrobe that actors would wear in Tudor times. So we were actually paid or commissioned, or she was paid, I was tagging along really, to parade through the streets, be Shakespeare, and she decided to be Anne Hathaway, but to present Anne Hathaway as a modern type woman, i.e. An independent feminist, strong woman, not the downtrodden wife that the narrative has given us. So by doing this, we then made a whole load of work, and because she was primarily the main artist in this, I had like months to just wander around Stratford and investigate and poke around, and I pretty soon discovered that the whole thing was fake. How it links into Bacon as well is that her uncle, Baron Tony von Reichard, was someone I became friends with. He was in the 60s. He was a dashing. He owned the gallery, Waddington Gallery in London. So he was a flamboyant art dealer, and the artist he represented the most was Francis Bacon. Now, Francis Bacon, I hope people know this, is a painter from after the war, supposedly a direct descendant of Sir Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon was also a painter who worked very much in the occult and orgiastic violence, and clearly his bloodline was a Bacon bloodline. So Baron von Reichard was Francis Bacon's dealer, but he dropped out in the 60s to go run a plantation of bananas in Queensland in Australia, so he disappeared from the scene. But I've got other connections to Francis Bacon, who I've been researching for probably 10 years, primarily as an artist, because I do admire his work. In the last part of the 20th century, a friend of mine, Derek Stockley, who was an abstract painter, used to drink with Francis Bacon in the colony rooms. And one night, Francis Bacon, as he would do regularly, asked my friend Derek if he would go back with him to have rough sex, and he would give him a painting, and he'd be a very rich man in the morning. So stories like this I've heard before, because Bacon was also... the thing I like about Francis Bacon, he was very much into the criminal underworld, a very reckless character, borderline genius, and he was also associated with the Cray twins in 60s London. Now the Cray twins were also MI5 assets, and that's a whole new story. So I felt that through people I know, I had a connection to Bacon, and also spending these 6 months in Stratford-on-Avon was a very strange part of my life, because I find the whole vibe in Stratford quite sinister, and now I kind of come to realise that it's just one big film set. What we're told is that Shakespeare, this semi-literate schoolboy, who they created a whole fake narrative about, wrote all these plays, 35 plays in the first folio, hundreds of sonnets, died at 52. No record of him ever having any books, any letters. He was the son of a glover. So when I started poking around, I pretty soon realised that things like Anne Hathaway's cottage were probably built much later, and in Victorian times a lot of scammers had perpetrated the Shakespeare myth, and it was already being debunked in Victorian times. So I got a bit of a surprise once, because I was seeing a lot of Chinese tourists arrive on coaches, and so I started asking these tourists what they were doing, what were they interested in about Shakespeare, and because Shakespeare had become a global phenomenon, which is a very important word with Shakespeare, because the Globe Theatre, which was very much under the control of Bacon and the British intelligence at the time, was really a precursor of this whole global philosophy. So in my view, Bacon was one of the fathers of modern day globalism. So the fact that these Chinese people were coming, and then I got some very interesting information in the sense that there's also an underground city in China where they've built like a whole Stratford-on-Avon, and it sounds ridiculous, but I understand there's other things like the Eiffel Tower. So in China, the non-rich Chinese who would come to the original, or if you want to call it the original, or the main fake Stratford-on-Avon, would travel and then go to see the other sites like Buckingham Palace and the whole tourist industry, and the poor people would go to the underground city and see replicas. So I thought that was quite amusing. So I then started making the work that I made in collaboration with with Carrie. Uh, oh no, let's go back to how I got initiated or brainwashed into the Shakespeare project. In that, when I was 10, I was at a school, and 3 years running, I won an award for being top boy. Now, this was partly, I was introduced to the mayor of London. It was deeply Masonic every year, and I think they put some money aside to for a poor boy from the borough to go to to a top grammar school, which was St Clement Danes, which was very much run on quasi Freemasonry, quasi military lines. So this book was awarded to me, and I think it was then that I really, the brainwashing started with education, and that I kind of cherished it, because coming from a long line of, I'm the first male in my line to be able to read and write. So, to actually get the complete works of Shakespeare, and coming from a gypsy background and a criminal background, I always kind of revered it and revered language. So I've still got this on my shelf, and I could never throw it away. But I began to realise that the brainwashing was started. We were studying. I studied Shakespeare all through secondary school, then at university. And if I know what I know now, those professors wouldn't have been able to get away with forcing this fake narrative down everybody. So when I went to Stratford-on-Avon, those months in 2018, I started playing around with one of the artworks that I've played around with for a while is sardine cans, for various reasons, because they're almost like time capsules. So my input there was I was going around all the tourist shops getting replicas, little toys of Shakespeare. Now there's loads of tourist shops in Stratford-on-Avon. It's a really big industry, and I suspect it's been a money spinner for many centuries, and they're not going to give it up at any time. So I was getting tacky toys. I was taking heads off of dolls and toys, getting images of Shakespeare, putting random things in. A lot of pagan symbolism is involved in these. Fake crowns and animals that are hybrids between hybrids and humans. So I work in a very instinctive way. So it's not as if I knew then what I knew now, but I did get a sense that the whole thing was a bit of a scam. So much to my delight, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust bought these pieces, and they're now hanging in the museum there, which is quite a delicious irony as far as I'm concerned. So I was very happy about that. But then it was recently when I started researching my work last year on D.H. Lawrence and Aleister Crowley, which were two rabbit holes that I really went down in. My research was extending out, as it always does, and I was being put in positions where I was meeting people. I was forming friendships with people who had connections to both Bacon and Shakespeare. Now that always happens to me, so I don't know whether it's the universe providing, but I do suspect it, because my DNA is still, it takes 15 generations to degrade. So the DNA that I have that I can work through my senses, I can go back to 1685, where my ancestor took part in the rebellion, hence the Rebel Not Taken brand, which is my brand there. So I've got DNA that took part in attempts to overthrow the monarchy, so I can understand fully what went on in this time in Tudor London and Elizabethan age, when the Catholics, the Protestants were at each other's throats. There was a lot of intrigue. It was really the start of developing the British intelligence system, and the bringing in the concept of the British Empire and patriotism. And I maintain that Francis Bacon, who pretty much was headed the Shakespeare programme, was instrumental, along with the intelligence service at the time. I'll talk about briefly, bringing in this programme. So that's the work I did. And again, when I'm working on something or researching it, I'm kind of channeling in a way, but I'm not going to say it's remote viewing. I don't want to be like thinking it's anything grandiose. But when I took my A-levels, I had a problem because I got expelled from school. And about a week before I was doing my literature A-levels, of which Shakespeare was a big part, I hadn't really done any work. So I managed to access the the exam papers that were presented to us and get the questions in advance. So that's something that I'm able to do. And it's a bit to do with gambling, with guessing, with manifesting, or just simply channeling what's going to happen. And the thing about Bacon, that Shakespeare was used for prescriptive programming, to bring in programs, and through the use of language and words, which are spells, to literally brainwash certainly people in England and all over the world that are brought into the Shakespeare project. So I did get A's, and I could have gone to Oxford, but I decided that I've ducked that whole thing most of my life. So that's a bit about my personal connections to Francis Bacon, and my time in Stratford-on-Avon, and it never stops, because I still meet people who are connected to them. As I did a bit with you last week on Paperclip, and I was thinking about that after we chatted, in the sense that the Americans, or a lot of the German scientists from the Nazi Party, in their thousands, went to America to form NASA, and similarly, a similar thing happened in England, because again, there's the Francis Bacon connection, because a lot of the artists after the war, I think England got quite a lot of the brilliant artists that are in Germany, like, for example, Lucian Freud, who probably has been the most preeminent artist, painter in the last 50 years, and along with Francis Bacon. And Lucian Freud was brought out of Germany as part of the scheme to bring a lot of talented cultural, potentially geniuses out to work in to program the English public. So Lucian Freud, of course, was part of what I call the Freud family, or the Freud family, which involves Sigmund Freud, a lot of links to Tavistock, and Clement Freud, who had a very dodgy reputation, which I think one of your guests, Michael Shrimpton, might have mentioned his involvement, or potential involvement, with the Maddie McCann mystery. So Freud was brought here, and one of my best friends, abstract artist called Sandra Blow, knew Lucian Freud when they were together as budding young artists, and he was deemed at the time to be an undesirable alien by the English society. What she told me was that he was a very desirable alien, because I think he bedded most of high society women, and probably men, spawned a load of bastards, and then became, his work is worth absolute millions. There's another connection with Francis Bacon that came out of my work on Where I Live at Zena, with my book Zena Spirit of Place, in the sense that there was an artist who was also moved out of Germany, called Karl Vetschke, who I befriended, and he was a parachutist in the SS, and he was captured and put into a concentration camp in Cambridge, which was run by the Quakers. Again, Quakers, bit Fabian background, and then he turned up in 1958 in the cottages on the farm where I now live. Now, this is not just another coincidence. He was bought out by a guy called Tom Dryberg, who was a communist, turned out to be a KGB agent, a very disreputable homosexual who was also linked with Aleister Crowley. He was a follower of Aleister Crowley, and of course the Crowley connection to where I live it just spreads, gives a lot more than I ever envisaged I would get. So Dryberg brought Karl Vetschke to Zeno. I befriended him at the end of his life, and then I found out that he had a whole fake background as well, with illegitimate children by members of the Thine family, or connections to the Thine family, the occult family that goes back through the Marquis of Bath. So this keeps happening, and Francis Bacon befriended Karl Vetschke. I'm not suggesting that Francis Bacon was involved in military intelligence, but he was put into situations where he became a very influential artist, working in nihilistic style. So, it's bringing in all this chaos. He was a chaos magician with a paintbrush, and also because of his connection to Sir Francis Bacon, who we're going to chat about. Obviously, he had a deep understanding of the occult, because the occult is in their bloodlines. But obviously I found out now that Francis Bacon wasn't a direct descendant of Sir Francis Bacon, because Sir Francis Bacon had a fake background story as well. So yeah, I'm going to go into that now. Right, these I think, Miles, you're a member of the Francis Bacon Society, and of course one of the tenets of that society.
I helped them do the videos. I did the videos for them for several years.
That was founded in 1885, I think, by a woman called Constance Pop, and she was one of the many proponents in Victorian times to promote the theory that the authorship debate, which a lot of people have tried to get in on this with their own claims, that Francis Bacon was the true author of running the Shakespeare program, and along with a lot of other artists at the time, writers and playwrights, constructed this whole work, and I fully am in agreement with that. And it was her also in, I think, in 1685, or she wrote a book linking Francis Bacon to the rise of Freemasonry in the Western world, which also is pretty easy to gather. So the Francis Bacon Society, there was other people at the time who were committed believers, like Mark Twain was a very good one, so was Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. There's a whole list of people at that time in Victorian times. But of course, these ideas were kind of a bit repressed because the Shakespeare industry, or the Shakespeare myth, he did work through myth. His work is all about myth and how language can control the mind, and it's a very early form of brainwashing, predictive programming, casting spells. So obviously they didn't want this known, but with the advent of the internet and things like this, there's a lot of really good researchers now who've pretty much nailed that idea that Bacon was the true author. And I just want to give credit to one guy called Robert Frederick, who's an American researcher who did an awful lot of work on Bacon's activities in the 25 years when he suddenly went from being one of the most important people in the country to virtually working underground. So I think his podcast is in plain sight. That's it. So okay, with his photos, at the time, it was common for members of the royal family to have their portraits painted in these little cameos, and Francis Bacon, there on the left, as you can see, he was painted along with his mother, Queen Elizabeth the First, who was called the Virgin Queen. Now, at this time, people might wonder why it was kept hidden that this was her secret son. You can see there's a resemblance, and when we look at Robert Dudley, who became the Earl of Leicester, the background, I'm not going to give a history lesson, but the background of this is that in 1554, I think it was, Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, were imprisoned in the Tower of London, because at that time there were lots of people making claims to the throne. I think it was Mary Queen of Scots that had bunged them in jail. So during the 2 months that she was there with Robert Dudley, who was also from a very important family, the Dudleys are still big landowners in the UK. They formed a relationship and became lovers. And then she actually came to the throne, I think 4 years later, but their relationship had been kept secret. And when you look at photograph of Francis Bacon and his mother, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and also compare it to the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, you can see there's a similarity, that they've got these fine features. Now, I haven't got the photographs here, but I've recently got photographs of Francis Bacon's pretend father, i.e. the family that they were put into, a guy called Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was actually Francis Bacon is the descendant, the painter is descended from them. And the photographs of Francis Bacon and Sir Nicholas Bacon, clearly show that they are from the same genetic stock, much more rough, peasant, completely different looking to these aristocrats. So when she became queen, one of the reasons that she was dubbed the Virgin Queen, because at that time the people that were running her were William Cecil and his hunchback son Robert Cecil, and the Earl of Essex. So basically, the power behind the throne was always exerted influence, and they more or less determined what path she would take. So by maintaining that she was a virgin, they were still courting suitors. So she was being pimped around with some of the princes in Europe. So at the time they were forming alliances that you could then strategically, at the time, we were involved with wars with the Spanish and things like that, and the intelligence services were using Queen Elizabeth I as almost like a pawn to say, well, if she marries your prince, we can form an alliance. But her main love was for Robert Dudley. That's the chap there, and so she was always in love with him. And when she became queen, the first thing she did was make him Master of the Horse, and which is quite an important position, because the Master of the Horse is the only person that can actually touch the Queen, and they have like a room in the bedchamber next to the Queen. So it's apparent, and it's become apparent, and it's pretty much proven now that they were lovers. So he was made Master of the Horse on the first day, and then a few years later he was made Knight of the Garter, which is also a very significant Freemasonry position dating back to the Knights Templars. So they kept this secret, and to all intents and purposes, Elizabeth was available for marriage to a foreign. I think she didn't. She had to go along with it. She had no choice otherwise they'd have taken her head off. Which is what they did in those days. So her son Francis was born in 1561, but in 1560, I think word had got round that these two were lovers, and they didn't want Dudley to come to the throne, although he would have had his son would have been the next heir. So at the time, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, his wife Amy Rodstart was found at the foot of her stairs with her neck broken, and clearly she was taken out because she discovered what was going on. And then there was a lot of subterfuge to keep this secret. Dudley became very important, but it was Francis Bacon, their son, who was had the best education that probably anyone could have had. He's had some of the finest minds as tutors. Now, at age 5, I think he wrote his first play at age 7. By the time he was 11, he was fluent in several languages, French, Italian, Latin, well versed in all literature, arts, falconry. They were actually born in. He was born in York Place, which was next to York House, which was the Queen's residence. And I only found out yesterday when I was delving a bit more into this. There's now Cleopatra's Needle, which is on the site where Francis Bacon was born. Which obviously got occult symbolism going back to Egypt. So Bacon had all his private education. He grew up next door, and the neighbours that lived in next door to where Elizabeth's residence was a guy called Sir Nicholas Bacon and his wife Lady Anne Bacon. So they became the fake family. They were kind of minor. They weren't royalty, but they weren't commoners either. So they brought up Francis Bacon in this fake environment. So the level of subterfuge, deception, fake identities, masks, fake narrative lies that were going on at this time in Tudor England just reflected, the fact that the intelligence agencies were operating, at a very high level. And Bacon, from an early age, was versed in occultism, in Gnosticism, in Rosicrucianism, because it was that time they needed to make the transition from the old world, which was to a certain extent the Renaissance, in order to bring in the new world, which was the Enlightenment. So there's whole philosophical things behind this, but effectively, as far as I'm concerned, Bacon was instrumental in making that transition into what has become the New World Order. when he wrote his philosophical tracts, it was called the New Instauration. So the whole concept of a new world order was already being established, and he also made that transition from magic to science, because scientism was more or less established in that time in Tudor London, and it was Bacon who was pretty much the conduit, because he worked in both worlds. So Bacon, when he was 11, I think he went to Trinity College, Cambridge, which has always been good college for spies. He was a prodigal genius, and he even dropped out of university because he didn't think the education was good enough. He was actually sent as a spy aged 15 to Bayonne for 3 years, which I think is where one of the headquarters of the Knights Templars in southwest France. And then he learnt a lot of the practices of he was initiated into Knights Templars, into Rosicrucianism, and and that's reflected in all of Shakespeare's plays. They're all steeped in ancient mystery schools, ancient religions, belief systems, deception, court scandals, homosexuality, transgenderism. It's all rife, and this is all part of the new order, or the agenda that Bacon was very much instrumental in promoting. So when he came back at 18, he was run by a guy called Sir Francis Walsingham, who I'll chat about in a minute. And John Dee was a very significant player in all of this, because there was this coterie of deep state actors who more or less were the power behind the throne, and they were predetermining and programming Britain to turn into what it was then to become. Which is basically, a feudal society run by the people that have esoteric knowledge, which is hidden knowledge, which, generally most people can't access. So at that time, it was very common for astrologers and magicians and conjurers to be as part of the court all over Europe, but they wanted to move towards what's called the scientific New World Order, or the technocracy, which was a totalitarian world order, which basically science had to become the new religion, the new god. Hence Darwin, which we've spoken about before, leads to transhumanism, and that's all connected to a lot of Baphomet worship, which we've also gone into. So in order to bring this in, Bacon was given great power to mastermind the Shakespeare project. So one of the ways they would do it was that he then became a lawyer. But Bacon was probably one of the most powerful men in England at the time, because he became Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was him that made it legal to charge interest on loans. So effectively, that was the bringing in of the financial system that operated out of the City of London. So he also transitioned Rosicrucian belief systems into Freemasonry, so that Freemasonry could then spread through the Western world in a very insidious way that was also more acceptable to the common man. So a lot of Shakespeare's the level of mythology and symbolism and spells and wordplay in Shakespeare was just phenomenal. I mean, clearly, someone who grew up in Stratford-on-Avon, in the houses where I went to, humble little cottages, left school, no books, no record of him ever doing anything, suggests to me that it's a completely fake story. And of course, when Robert Dudley, when they had the child, Robert Dudley was made given a lot of power. Francis Bacon was brought up by this fake family who lived next door, but it was effectively the Elizabeth that was funding his progress. And so Bacon then became a lawyer at Gray's Inn, and the first Shakespeare play to be shown to the public was Comedy of Errors, and that was in 1594. And that was shown at Gray's Inn in the law firms, part of the Temple, where Francis Bacon. So it's pretty easy to go through all the plays, all the things that happen. Then Francis Bacon seemed to disappear for 25 years. From he was being an MP, so he was paid, he was funded by the Crown, and he was effectively running the Shakespeare project. But it wasn't him alone. because there was other guys who were also involved in this project, playwrights at the time, like Ben Jonson, who was a playwright, as was Christopher Marlowe Spencer. So I think they were all involved with this project, which was being managed by the Globe Theatre Management Company, which often they'll have these like innocent sounding front corporations or companies or associations to run this. And it was Ben Jonson who made the line that Francis could never resist a jest. And all through Shakespeare, there's lots of in-jokes that relate to the true, the true Elizabeth's true son being Francis Bacon being Shakespeare. And I think in 1895, an American researcher called Elizabeth Gallup, she started decoding all the ciphers that were in Shakespeare's plays that Francis Bacon had put in, and then did a whole load of research on ciphers. And of course, this is kind of interesting to me because obviously he was a master of ciphers, and that relates very much back to secret numerology, gematria, the Kabbalah, which Bacon was very versed in at the time. A lot of people were versed in these skills, but they didn't want these skills to be given to the public, so the knowledge was kept esoteric. So what they did, they created a fake science in order for people to have to trust the science. So a lot of the knowledge went underground. It went underground with the Freemasons and the Illuminati, but it did spread. But the lower level initiates, it was all involved in initiation as well. So lower level initiates didn't really know what they were doing. They were, doing what they perceived to be good works. But obviously at the higher levels, the people that could access the knowledge were still conducting a lot of magic. So magic became science in a very weird way by forcing magic underground, by supposedly banning it, which when we talk about John Dee and Walsingham, we can show that. And then people were presented with the new religion, which was Bacon also promoted, because Bacon was a Renaissance man who had all this knowledge and incredible education, and obviously talent for languages and a lot of arcane things, as was Aleister Crowley. We talked about him before, the level of knowledge that he had, that it's impossible to get all that knowledge just by study. You have to be able to channel knowledge or access it through mediums, through spirits, through guides. So Bacon then became like the master of science, and so he had a double edge. So he was a Renaissance man and was also enlightened. So he transitioned from the Renaissance, which is a very humanistic philosophy, into the Enlightenment, which became, it sounds great, but the Enlightenment, of course, is what Freemasons and occultists and Gnostics aspire to. And the Enlightenment came to be not so much the spiritual enlightenment, but the new false enlightenment, which was then connected to bringing in concepts of theory of evolution and making that separation from God and the divine or whatever belief systems people experienced before. So the ciphers are really interesting because I've kind of spent far too much time going through the plays looking for ciphers and codes. And literally you could spend dozens of lifetimes doing that. And I know people who are obsessively working out more ciphers now that Bacon put in. And there's also people that believe that Bacon was programming the future, and that you could, it was very dangerous for him to do what he was doing then, or for anyone to make any political comments, because both sides were getting executed. My great grandfather ×8 was hunted down by Judge Jeffreys. So if he hadn't gone underground, I wouldn't be alive today. So the Shakespeare project was just happily going along, and Bacon, I don't know where to start with him, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because it's so complicated, and like it really is. But the thing I'm saying about ciphers that interests me, in the sense that me growing up in an illiterate household, I don't even think English was my first language, because my father and all his brothers, like between 13 and 18 of them, had a kind of almost their own language, and it was like a combination of rhyming slang and gypsy back slang. So this language was used a lot by people like criminals and market traders. So during Tudor times, anyone, i.e. the peasants in this feudal society, they had to be very careful what they said, because they could be just taken away and hung from, from Wapping Bridge, or beheaded. So the level of control over free speech was bad then, but as it is now, because if they were like going against the official narrative, or the deep state in Tudor times, was tantamount to treachery, which was punishable by execution. So a bit like similar to what's going on now, in the sense that if you exercise your free speech, you are liable to be either censored or cancelled, or maybe given sudden death. So Tudor times and today's, with this feudal control system that is based around the Great Reset, the New World Order, there's a lot of similarities that one can draw. And by me growing up in this situation where we were using, like, we would count up to 10, and it would be backslang. So it would be Eno out, Reef, Ralph, Evis, Ix, and that's when you reverse the numbers. So even then, I grew up with a lot of rhyming slang, a lot of swearing, because I think there was Tourette's in my family. So I then became interested in how words connect to spells and ciphers and codes, and you can almost have your own private language. As I had my own currency as well. Maybe I've not taken banknotes. And this is one way of kind of playing them their own game, or beating their own game, because if you're in the market, or if you're in a pub, there's likely to be eavesdroppers, policemen, even worse, semi-five fucktards. So you have to kind of almost have a way of not letting them access your information, just like we can't access their information. So yeah, I'm going to get on to now to the intelligence stuff. Two very significant people around this time were John Dee, who was the Queen's conjurer. Now John Dee was another brilliant man, an alchemist, an astrologer, and he was employed by Elizabeth to run all the kind of not so much the intelligence operations, but the magic, the occult activities. And this is his mate Edward Kelly, who was his scryer. And they caused quite a scandal at the time, because John Dee had the biggest occult library that I think has ever been amassed. And they were also necromancers. So they were up to all sorts, and Kelly was a disreputable, well, they presented him as a disreputable character, but he was the muse for Dee, because a lot of magicians need a muse or a goddess in order to channel through, and they used to go and dig up dead bodies and summon spirits, and they were brought into court life because they were able to tap into Enochian magic using the Enochian keys. Now, Enochian magic is where they would summon entities, angels, otherworldly. Maybe now it's ETs, or Crowley believed he was the reincarnation of John Dee, and he had similar talents, but they would always use a muse or a medium. So Kelly was his medium, and there was a lot of strange things happening at that time, because although we were moving into the transition into the science age, Dee was instrumental in astrology predicting Queen Mary Scott's death, working with Queen Elizabeth. And one of the things they did was to defeat the Spanish Armada, which was much more powerful than the British Armada. And how it was done apparently was by Dee controlling the weather, whipping up a storm or a tempest, which more or less decimated the Spanish fleet. So this is all a mystery at the time, but of course now when you think about HARP weather systems and how we can create tornadoes and floods and tsunamis, it's not much of a stretch to think, well, okay, there's now scientific methods of doing it, but I don't know whether they didn't have those methods then either, and that a lot of those methods are linked to occult rituals and summoning of various forces, which happens all the way through Shakespeare's plays, with these natural disasters that suddenly change nation states. So John Dee, the head of intelligence at that time was a guy called Sir Francis Walsingham, and he was entrusted by Elizabeth to run, set up what became, or was the precursor of the SIS, which then became, obviously the three-letter intelligence agencies. But this was very much rife in in Tudor London. And Walsingham was a master at this, and having undercover spies, and a lot of these playwrights, including Bacon, obviously, and the Shakespeare project. A lot of those playwrights that I mentioned earlier were also involved in gathering secret intelligence and programming it to the masses. So they were all. I'm not saying Francis Bacon wrote everything, but all these other playwrights and poets were brought into this scheme, and that's why people like the Oxfordonians, who can stake their claim that Edward de Vere wrote a lot of wrote Shakespeare's plays. Well, he probably wrote some of them, as did Ben Jonson, because they all vary very much. They're all different. And the thing about Bacon was that he had a lot of knowledge, but he was he wasn't. I wouldn't say he was a streetwise man. So he when James I came to the throne, James I wanted to move on from Elizabeth's world. So to a certain extent, he marginalised people like John Dee because they wanted to keep that in the background. So they were all kind of given the sack effectively. And Bacon realised that the powers that be didn't want him to ascend to the throne because that would expose the lie. So he was marginalised as well, and he then decided to get married, and he married a 13-year-old girl. Francis Bacon was a committed homosexual, as was James I. So James I was having affairs with many of his servants, including the Duke of Buckingham. So the court at that time was predominantly homosexual, and of course the theatre world was also predominantly homosexual, or probably 90% homosexual. So you'd get like boys playing girls, and transgender. The plays are full of transgender imagery, and so Bacon married this unfortunate girl of 13 in order to. It was more or less a symbol or a code to show that he would relinquish his right to the throne, because if you marry a commoner, you lose your right to the throne. What was telling was that when he got married, he was dressed or decked from head to toe in purple. Now, commoners weren't allowed to wear purple under the law in 1464, so the fact that he wore purple also signified it was his, he was allowed to do that to signify it by secret methods that he was a member of the royal family, effectively, Elizabeth's son. So they came to agreements, and he then his wife, his young wife, 20 years later, was having an affair with one of Bacon's servants. Bacon was having affairs with his servants, and a lot of these in-jokes and these things were replicated in Shakespeare's plays. So a lot of the court life was laid out. So a lot of these secrets were actually put into the words of William Shakespeare, because Bacon or the others in their positions couldn't actually voice all this scandal. There was a lot of humour in it, and a lot of jokes, and a lot of sexual innuendo, but they couldn't really voice what was going on in the court with the politics and the Rosicrucian symbolism. So Shakespeare is full of all these ciphers and codes. And the other thing I was interested in the sense that I've had a few rows with these Shakespeare academics. When I was in Stratford, I was drinking champagne with some of them, and of course they refused to accept anything about Shakespeare not being a real person. But I wondered why there's no Shakespeare signed nothing. He didn't have any books. He was born. There was no record of when he was born, but they made his birthday St George's Day. Of course, with connotations going back to Knights Templars with St George. They made his death St George's Day, April the 23rd. So again, they work through dates, through numbers, through numerology, and it's all, words are very significant, and words all have hidden meanings. So when Bacon lived for 10 years after Shakespeare, but what I asked these academics, when Shakespeare's writings, or I think there's only 5 examples of his signature, and one of them to do with one of the plays was written Shake, Shake, hyphen, Spear, Speare. these academics, I said, well, what's this? What's that mean? And they couldn't really give me an answer. And I actually found out what it meant in the sense that Francis Bacon's personal muse. Now, a lot of artists at that time have personal muses. I, as an artist, have worked through muses as well, and that means you're working through other people to channel their information, and that can be done in many ways. Sex magic rituals are one of them, of course, to download mind files from other people. But the reason that Francis Bacon made this joke was that, which was a code for telling other learned people that he was the true author of Shakespeare, was that his personal muse was Athena. Now, Athena was the Greek goddess of treachery, secrecy, and war, and her symbol was she was the spear shaker. So the fact that he put that little joke in one of Shakespeare's things was a signal to future generations that maybe only 300-400 years later can now be decoded, because there's people decoding Shakespeare now, just as decoders at Bletchley Park would decode ciphers. So this has very much been a big part of British intelligence, in the sense they'll employ psychics, and still do to this day, because they can access codes, and because they have another way of analysing information. And of course, then you get into the realms of computer language, which is almost becomes a transhumanist way of decoding information. Now, most of these psychics, I've got experience of psychics who work for British intelligence, including Crowley, who worked through 3 female mediums, well, 3 of many throughout his life, and I've gone into a bit of that in the book Zen and Spirit of Place. So the intelligence services were operating, and they were using these playwrights to disseminate information to the public, but they wanted to for the public to buy into the whole concept of science as being the new religion. It was quite an existential atmosphere at the time, because a lot of Shakespeare's plays were very nihilistic, in the sense that there's no meaning to anything. And of course, part of the new science is that you have to abandon all your old belief systems and family, spirituality, in order to become pawns in the deep state. So I'm not going to analyse the plays. I'm assuming that most people would know Macbeth, Hamlet, some of the plays that Francis Bacon wrote under the name of William Shakespeare. And they're all incredibly complicated, with lots of double meaning, lots of words as disguising meaning, lots of puns, lots of innuendo, lots of promotion of agendas that now have come to pass. So the whole globalist agenda was pretty much kicking off then. The transgender agenda was being put in people's brains. And what it was that you'd give the people that used to go to the theatre, like the poor people or the peasants, that will pack out the globe, you'd give them information on a level that they could understand. So there'd be a lot of bawdy scenes, in taverns, in inns, a lot of sexual innuendo, that people could appreciate on a humorous level. And some of Shakespeare's plays are actually hilarious. But then on the deeper level, they're not going to decipher the language, the double meanings, the numerology. That takes an awful lot of work. So by programming them, just like we talk about, give them bread and circuses, like entertainment, sports, as we do now, Netflix, football games. You can brainwash the public with language which is being used as a spell. So I'll just chat about a couple of the plays, but any one of these, takes a hell of a lot of deciphering. So Macbeth, the opening line of Macbeth is "Fair is foul and foul is fair." So we're already into inversion of the natural world. And the 3 witches are very significant. Probably the most significant part of Macbeth is that the first scene is in Scotland, where these witches are casting spells on people, and they more or less haunt the whole play, and the whole tragedy that unfolds is pretty much done by people, these witches cursing. So even traditionally in the theatre, actors, it's considered the a very unfortunate play to be in because it's attached to a lot of bad luck. And one of the things that actors, they talk about the Scottish play, they're not even allowed to call it Macbeth. And one of the things they say is break a leg, in the sense that if you've been acting in Macbeth, it's very likely that bad things are going to happen to you. And you could even go as far as to say that the spells or the incantations that the witches do at the start of Macbeth and then throughout the play, as events unfold and tragedies unfold, they're always in the background, almost like I've said last week, very much a bit like intelligence agents who can use mind programming, MK skills of hypnosis, mesmerism, using words to mesmerize people and deceive them. So fair is foul and foul is fair is already an inversion in the sense that it's about replacing the natural world with an artificial world, which leads to a transhuman world, so a synthetic world. And this is done by magic, and it's done by incantation. And throughout the play, the witches are there. I mean, other very talented people have made interpretations of Macbeth, including Orson Welles, who I think in the 40s he did a Macbeth where the three witches were voodoo priestesses. J.K. Rowling said that the whole Harry Potter was based on the three witches. Roman Polanski, one of my favourite film directors, made a film of Macbeth in I think 1971, and ironically a few years earlier his wife Sharon Tate had been murdered by Charlie Manson and three women. So the whole witch thing is connected to the occult, and in one of the scenes in Macbeth is a guy called Banquo who gets murdered, and it was the witches that then decided that the descendants of Banquo would be the heirs and the rulers of this world, or their world, the Western world, and not the descendants of Macbeth. Well, Banquo was murdered in Act 3, Scene 3, which is also significant because it's 33, the level of Freemasonry initiation, above which you have to accept that Lucifer is the true God. So it links back to a lot of Gnosticism, and Bacon was certainly a Gnostic, in the sense that Gnostics believe that, which goes back to the time of Jesus. One of the first Gnostics was Simon Magus. So the whole concept of the Magus, the magician, was around very much at that time, and then throughout the Roman Empire. And in fact, it links into the Irish as well, because the Irish believed that Simon Magus, they called him Simon the Druid, and Magus is someone I want to investigate. Where was I? So yeah, Banquo's ghost. The witches deemed that the descendants of Banquo would become the rulers. Now, James I, who took over from Elizabeth I to become James I of England, and James I of England, yeah, he claimed that he was descended from Banquo, and he might well have been, because Banquo was based on a real person, as was Macbeth. But the interesting thing about James I is that descendants of James I became presidents of the United States. So James I who really brought in this Bacon's controlled New World Order, or globalist vision of how the English Empire could spread out and through Freemasonry lodges and literally keep control of the world. I think the 14th president was Pierce, and the 15th was Buchanan, and they both, it would seem through genealogical research, to be direct descendants of James I, which is a weird story in itself. And even the other day, I want to stop researching these people, because I found out that Percy, the Percys, who another family behind the power, were instrumental in the gunpowder plot, the Guy Fawkes plot, which is about discrediting the Catholics of having a false flag operation to blow up House of Parliament when James I was sitting there. It was probably an inside job, like a lot of them are. And Guy Fawkes, of course, had connections to Will Shakespeare, the peasant in Stratford-on-Avon. So, a lot of these actors, are brought into it. And then, as I said, Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, so they come on, they play their part, and then they go. But it's all part of, enacting out these agendas. So the three witches, they appear, and there's a lot more I could say about Macbeth, but I think I don't want to go too much into it. Just before we get on to the last bit, Hamlet is another very significant, probably perceived to be Shakespeare's or Bacon's greatest play, and it really, everything that Freud and psychoanalysts went on to talk about was more or less written out in the character of Hamlet. So when he says to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," a lot of the Gnostic belief systems were that basically they didn't believe that God, the traditional God, was the true God, that he was an imposter and that he was a demiurge, and that he had to be replaced, and he would be replaced by Lucifer or by illumination. So the concept was that humans have been trapped in their body in matter, in the physical realm, by the demiurge, and they can't ascend beyond this unless they receive illumination. And of course, receiving illumination is very much part of the ritual that Freemasons and the Knights Templars would get involved in, and often it would involve not nice things. And so part of that Gnostic belief system is that by people constantly reincarnating, the demiurge is keeping people in the soul trap to harvest their energy, and in order to release yourself from this soul trap, you need to be illuminated. So then, when you get, that's obviously a big agenda of the 20th century with with transcending matter. So when Hamlet says, "Get thee to a nunnery," and Lady Macbeth says, "Unsex me now," it's an early form of programming to move away from the binary concept of sex between a man and a woman. So that she says, "Unsex me now," i.e. it doesn't mean shag me, it means take away my female sex. And so all through these plays, there's a lot of subliminal programming to the transgender movement, which of course is a precursor to transhumanism. And I think Bacon was they were all very aware of what they were doing with that. Another interesting play, which, well, it's worth looking at, is The Tempest. Now, The Tempest is very much to do with Freemasonic initiation, and clearly only someone like Bacon, who had very advanced knowledge of these worlds, could use all that symbolism, where the character Prospero is what's called a hierophant. So he becomes the god of this scientific community that I think was set around Bermuda or Bahamas, or in any case, it's got connections to it's got Atlantis mythology and Bermuda Triangle and things like that. But he becomes like the god scientist of this cult, and the Tempest is very much part of that. And the hierophant, if you look at the tarot deck, Aleister Crowley's Thoth tarot deck, I've deconstructed the hierophant, and it's just full of Egyptian Gnostic mythology, satanic, Freemasonic. There's about 20 things in that one tarot card that you could depict. And of course, Crowley, identified as the hierophant, and he also identified as John Dee. So The Tempest is significant. And also, there's another book which came out later called New Atlantis, which very much links back to H.G. Wells's theories about the New Order, and then America becoming the New Babylon, and America being infiltrated by the Freemasons. That Francis Bacon was instrumental in setting up the Jamestown colony as well. I'm missing a lot of stuff here, but I'm just trying to be brief. Setting up the slave colony in Jamestown, and so yeah, the New Atlantis. Again, each of these books requires an awful lot of deciphering. But what I kind of like is that the fact that there's always these little jokes all the time that like titillate you and lead you in. So in a sense, by engaging in the Shakespeare hoax, which I have done for 60 years, effectively we're all taking part in this ritual, because we're all listening to these incantations, and and we're all, being affected by the numbers that are being used, the combination of numbers, the codes, the ciphers that are being implanted into our brain. And I think one of the things that I illustrated in my art was that how Shakespeare was used to bred a certain type of Englishman that is patriotic and is prepared to die for the Red Cross. The Red Cross being the Rosicrucian cross, and the Wars of the Roses. Again, it's a big occult Hegelian dialectic where you pit two sides against each other, and the rose. It's all through Shakespeare's work. So, I mean, that's all very fascinating, and certainly in an ideal world, I would go back and read all of Shakespeare all over again with a different interpretation. But I think we're just going to finish off with this image, which I saw. I remember at the time thinking, it's so weird that the COVID hoax is somehow connected to the Shakespeare hoax, and once you can deconstruct one hoax, it's pretty much easy to deconstruct another one, and a lot of it is to do with the mocking the public, which is another quite a luciferic thing that people do by using metaphors and plays within plays. And as I mentioned last week, the first man to be injected with the COVID-19 vaccine was William Shakespeare. So I heard someone the other day talk about them being William Shakespeared, which I thought was a good metaphor for being vaccinated or being brought into this new matrix, this new control system, transhumanism. And here we go, the BBC News, the British Brainwashing Company. Love that headline. Shakespeare gets COVID vaccine, all's well that ends well. I mean, that's another use of one of Shakespeare's plays, a kind of comedy that already we've got, well, it's all going to be okay in the end, despite all the things that have happened in the meantime. And even then, is this a needle which I see before me, is a quote from Macbeth, actually. Is this a dagger which I see before me? I'm just busking now on this, I haven't researched this, but again, you change needle for dagger, and you can see it's William receiving the first dose. I mean, just hilarious. I mean, as I said, I think it's the biggest hoax perpetrated on the British public, and it goes on and on, and well, maybe it's much ado about nothing.
Am I answering that question, Bob?
Well, I don't know. Want me to? You got anything you want to say? I mean, I've left an awful lot out because.
Well, do you want to continue a sort of a part 10B if you want to have another wee thought?
I think what the problem is that it could become a bit of a history lesson, because I think, given the facts that I've come to my conclusions through my own deductive reasoning, and also another thing that Bacon introduced was what's called inductive reasoning. So he stopped that whole believing in magic thing, even though they all believed it and they all use it, and they use it to this day. So they still would employ magicians, but there will be a different kind of magician. So while Dee used the crystals and the obsidian mirror from Aztec obsidian mirror to join entities, the people that are working now will use other devices. Like, you could even think that Project Looking Glass, the CIA project for seeing the future,
or the black mirror in our in our phones. Every phone is a black mirror.
That's right. So everything that's happening now, it's not things that have just been created or devised. I mean, the whole concept of the Great Reset and the New World Order, this was all very much being programmed into the public then, and also probably programmed into the occult. And the power of the occult, it's very difficult to go against it. But as I said, it's still underground, and the people that, the psychic warfare, remote viewing, they're drawing on methods that Dee was perfecting. Francis Bacon, well, I think one of the most brilliant minds that we've ever seen. Highly important. A lot of the things that are happening now are due to the transition that Francis made from the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, and of course, being William Shakespeare, he's affected millions of people all over the planet who live believing that Shakespeare was a real person.
Well, I think that's an opportune moment to drink beer and be happy or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that Shakespeare?
I wore this T-shirt for my friends in Australia who have a podcast where they picked up one of my podcasts from before where I was talking about my monkey called Wanker, which, you know, we did have a monkey called Wanker, and I'm going to write about it in my book, Be Lucky.
No worries, mate.
Yeah, and the fact that I'd also talked
Sorry, that was a bad Cockney accent.
Also talked about Jack Parsons and a lot of Crowley stuff, and of course that was the thing that they put on to show what a load of lunatics we are over here in the old country, you know, and how how we entertain ourselves with these.
Well, the Australians and New Zealanders have complied, like the Canadians and the Irish and the Scottish and the Welsh.
Of course they have. Well, the Australians had complied because it was always a prison colony, and that's what we were testing as a prison colony. I love Australia. I mean, I've worked out there many times, and
it's a brilliant place. It's just full of Australians.
I don't mind the Australians. Well, the old Australians, you know, the old ones who would sit in the bar and talk a glass eye to sleep and talk about cricket and Don Bradman and swear and, you know.
I've never heard that phrase, talking a glass eye to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. I could have gone over when I was a kid on the £10 assisted passage scheme. I thought about it because I qualified for it. I could have gone there for £10, and one of my friends who went is now a bloody billionaire with property all over Sydney. And he said the thing is they wanted all us young Brits to go, young kids, because they were poor and they worked hard, whereas all the Australians were lazy. So all they did was sit on the beach and drink beer. And when I went out there, I remember meeting this guy who was from Putney, and he said, I really miss London, I miss going to the football and I miss everything about it, you know, the banter, the humour and all that. He said, I said, well, why'd you carry on working, you know, you're running all these businesses, getting stressed out? He said, well, one day I'm going to be able to just sit on the beach and drink beer. I said, well, you can do that now. You could do it any day, you know.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much indeed. This is really important work we're doing here.
Thank you. Break a leg.